Hey, it's Rabanzo. I'm shaking things up and speaking before the intro music. The best way to support this podcast, by the way, is to join the Unstarving Musician community. It's easy to do. Just go to unstarvingmusician.com and join right there on the homepage. If you're an independent musician, you'll be glad you joined because I share expertise and lessons you can use in your music journey. And it isn't just coming from me and my years of experience as a gigging musician, but also it's coming from the hundreds of other musicians I've talked to as part of the Unstarving Musician Project, including those I've interviewed for this podcast. And that's all for free, just for being part of the Unstarving Musician community. Being part of the community also allows me to inform you of new podcast episodes and special offers that are and will be exclusive to the Unstarving Musician community. This is all 100% intended to serve you and other independent musicians. In the process, this community will become sustainable, able to serve more and more independent music artists like you. Okay, now let's move towards the show that you actually tuned in for, and thank you, by the way, for tuning in. I really appreciate you. I want to share a couple of videos, new videos by former guests before I get on to today's guest, and I share them with you because I think they are very cool, as are the artists who made them. One of them is by Ezra Van Seal. Interesting thing about Ezra is I found him on Twitter because of a video he had posted there. He also shared on this podcast how he's learned to successfully put together volunteer teams to make the production of his wonderful videos happen. The song for this video is called Broken King. You can search for it on YouTube. Just look for Broken King by Ezra Van Seal, and that's E-Z-R-A, and his last name is V-A-N-C-I-L. The second video is by an artist named Joe George. Last year, Joe told me on this podcast that he was going to release a song with a video for each month of the year, which he did, and it looks like he's still up to it. I checked out his latest video, and I think you should too. Joe is an interesting guy. His music-related day job is very cool, and like I said earlier, so is he. Creative as hell, that's what he is. That's what he is. The song is called Changes Are on the Run. You can also find it on YouTube, so just search for Changes Are on the Run by Joe George. I think you're going to like it. Both tunes are, as I said, on YouTube, but they'll be in the show notes for this episode, which you can find at unstarvingmusician.com/podcast. And both artists, being former guests of the podcast, you can just search for them by name on unstarvingmusician.com. Again, that's Ezra Van Seal and Joe George. Or just search the aforementioned unstarvingmusician.com/podcast page. Search by name and you'll find those episodes there. They were both a couple of my favorite episodes or interviews that I did here. All right, on to the rest of the show and today's guest. Let's do it. This is the Unstarving Musicians Podcast. I'm your host, Rabanzo. This podcast features conversations with me and indie music artists. Conversations intended to help other indie musicians be better at marketing, business, the creative process, and all the other things that empower us to do more of what we love. Make music. Justin Trawick, my guest for this episode, was recommended to me by mutual friend and former guest of this podcast, Eli Lev. Justin is and has been a marketing machine for his music journey, but he's definitely reached the point where being 100% DIY is no longer making sense. He very humbly shares an example of where spreading himself too thin has come to bite him in the butt, so to speak. I believe that because he is so humble, he was actually able to parlay that particular incident into a good outcome, and it makes for a great story. Among his many projects are his band, The Common Good, a podcast, and a recurring touring songwriters show/festival. Of course, with all of this comes marketing, legwork, logistics, coordination, etc., hence he's spread a little thin. We started the conversation with him asking me, or saying to me rather, that I came across as highly organized myself, which made me laugh a little bit. I'm thinking he has to be highly organized based on his online presence, which you should check out at justintrawick.com, and the various projects and quality work that he's done. You'll hear a track called All the Places That I've Been by Justin and The Common Good at the end of our conversation, and you will see what I mean. Quality work. Anyway, Justin sees himself at times as overextended, which may be true. It's still pretty darn impressive to witness all that he's doing and accomplishing. Okay, here is me and Justin Trawick. You ready?
Hell yeah, man. I've been ready. I was interviewing you.
I know. Well, thank you again for joining me, and thank you for all the questions about my choice to be an expat in Panama. I knew I was laughing on the inside because I know you have a podcast, which I want to ask you about, and yes, I was joking, calling you Mr. Interviewer so that I could squeeze in a couple of pre-recording questions for you. But tell me about the podcast. What inspired you to start it? It looks like you have some co-conspirators on that. So what was the inspiration to get it going? And tell me a little bit in terms of what it's about.
I have a podcast called The Circus Life. The Circus Life is named after one of my songs. I really, when I started the podcast, I started it with a friend of mine named Sean Russell. And Sean is a recording engineer here in the DC area, and we've known each other for 10 years. He was the first guy he was the person who recorded my first record after college. And, I'd grown up in Northern Virginia, as a 90s kid. It always bothers me, Roberto, when people that are my age who are, I'm 37, I just turned 37. They call themselves 80s kids, but that's not true. I feel like, you tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like you are a whatever generation kid of when you were in high school. You know what I mean? Or at least middle school and high school. And so for me, my high school experience was the 90s. So it's 96 through 2000. And middle school was obviously 3 years before that. So, for me, it's grunge and all that stuff. And during that time, when I was in high school and probably little middle school, I was listening to a radio show, a nationally syndicated radio show called Love Line with Adam Carolla and Dr. Drew.
I remember.
If you ever listened. Yeah. And, as a 12, 13-year-old, smaller Justin Trawick, my parents probably would have been extremely upset that their only child was listening to a show called Love Line, which is very much a relationship and sex call-in show with a comedian and a doctor. Mm-hmm. But it was really probably like my first experience listening to not only older people giving advice to freely to a younger audience, but also like my first encounter of like a radio comedy kind of duo, similar to like Car Talk or anything like that. Howard Stern, Don and Mike.
Other classics.
Yeah. So, smash cut to, 2000 and, 2008, 5 years ago from now. So smash cut to about 5 years ago. And I just had this idea, I really wanted to do my own kind of show, where, being a musician, I could talk with other touring acts, regional acts, anything like that. But I'm not a technical person. I mean, I can, operate a computer. I can do technical stuff, but, I don't know how to use Pro Tools, and I don't really want to set aside time to learn. Not that I can't, but because I'm already doing a lot of things, I love the idea, and I've always been really, really good at delegating, finding someone that knows how to do something and we doing something together. I think that it's life is about a strength in numbers. I'm sure my girlfriend is extremely good at learning everything. That's great. But it puts a lot of pressure on you if you have to be in charge of everything in your life. It's so much better to build a team. And also as a full-time singer-songwriter, I do a lot of things on my own. And when I created this podcast, I created it with a buddy because I just didn't want to do it by myself. I wanted to do it as a project with someone else. So Sean Russell and I did this podcast for 4 years. We've had some great acts. Kevin Eubanks from Tonight Show with Jay Leno came on, and Chris Thomas King, who is the guitarist in the movie Oh Brother Where Art Thou? Yeah. Yeah. The guy who sold his soul to the devil with my guitar in that movie.
Crossroads? No, that's Steve Vai. Different movie.
Yeah. But we had some great guests, and a large part of the great guests was we got lucky with a few early guests, because I think you probably know this from doing your own podcast. Nobody really ever wants to be a litmus test. That, you know, you have to get like a couple big people on before. If you get a couple big people on, it makes it a lot easier to get more interesting people, because you can kind of like send them your synopsis of what your bio, your podcast bio, and they'll see, oh, these people came on. Yeah, I want to do that too. Similar to why I'm doing this today, because I'm a friend of Eli Leb, and, you know, I highly respect the things that he does. And I saw that he did your podcast. So when you messaged me, I was like, totally, I'll do this if Eli's doing it.
That's nice.
So, yeah, I did that for 4 years with Sean. And then last year, Sean just got really busy with life. He had some personal things going on with his family. And so I've actually started doing it on my own. And I've changed the format of it a little bit, where it was more kind of like, zoo, like morning zoo kind of format, where it was like me and Sean and a couple other like regular guests, as well as a touring act, like a featured guest. Now it's really kind of just me and a touring act, or sometimes even just me. Because I think for me, the podcast is turning into just another avenue of connecting with people that are interested, not only in music and not only in the people that I interview, but also just me in general, my music, my band. I do something called the 9 Songwriter Series, which happens in DC, but also happens outside of DC in other cities like New York and Philly. We're doing one in San Francisco in April. So I think that the podcast is just becoming, just like social media as well, just in general, is just a whole lot of different avenues for people to engage with me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's great. I'm really happy to hear you say that. I have not really leveraged this podcast in the same way, but given the format that I have and wanting to help other musicians, I've been wondering for a while how many of the working musicians that I talk to might, be or benefit themselves from doing something like a podcast. So the song, you mentioned something else I wanted to ask about, the 9 Songwriter Series. Can you give me a little background on that? And also, it would be interesting to hear how the podcast and that series are playing off of one another for either for awareness or just, helping you make it all happen.
So the 9 Songwriter Series came about in 2008. My last day job before I started doing music full time ended in 2008. And right around the same time that my last day job was ending and I started doing music full time, I came up with this idea that had stemmed from 2 other things that were happening at that time. In LA, you probably know there's a venue called Hotel Cafe. Have you ever heard of Hotel Cafe?
No. I've not spent a lot of time in LA, though, even though I lived in California for 17 years. But please continue.
Oh, okay. So in LA, there's a place in Hollywood, right in the middle of Hollywood, just like a couple blocks away from like the Chinese theater and stuff. And it's called Hotel Cafe, and it's ground zero for being a singer-songwriter in the LA area, and a very well-known touring spot. There's an equivalent in New York called Rockwood Music Hall, if you've heard of that, maybe. Mm-hmm. And Rockwood is another place that is New York's version of Hotel Cafe. In fact, I'm not even sure. Hotel Cafe might be, LA's version of Rockwood Music Hall, but they both are these like ground zero for the best of the best singer-songwriters and bands that are, singer-songwriter based, and where a lot of people start and become famous. Like Rockwood Music Hall, for example, is where Ingrid Michaelson got started. A band called The Lone Bellow, which is a huge touring band now. And Hotel Cafe is basically just anyone you've heard on the radio, on pop radio, kind of got started there. And back around 2005, 6, 7, there was this thing called the Hotel Cafe Tour, which was happening all over the country. And basically the Hotel Cafe Tour was all these regular musicians that were in the Hotel Cafe scene in Hollywood and LA got together, and they're like, well, we all play together all the time. We're all like working on our craft. We're doing pretty well, but if we tour in a group, it might be easier to get into some of the better venues that we've had a hard time getting into on our own. So that Hotel Cafe tour was happening, and it happened all over the country. And a lot of big people that I listen to, Bob Schneider, who's one of my favorite artists, who is based in Austin, did a couple tours with them, and a lot of people. At the same time, in Nashville, there was something called 10 out of 10. And 10 out of 10 was T-E-N out of T-E-N-N. 10 people out of Tennessee, Nashville specifically. And it was this national tour based of 10 singer-songwriters touring with, and also touring with the drummer. So 11 people total. And they were also all multi-instrumentalists. So in the show, each of them would play 2 songs, and when they weren't playing their 2 songs, they'd be part of the official backing band. And so the entire show was a rock show where everyone was contributing, and it was really one of the coolest shows I'd ever seen. There's a venue that's no longer here in Arlington anymore, which is 5 minutes from Washington, D.C. in Virginia, called IOTA, and I saw 10 out of 10 there, and it was just unbelievable to see the musicianship and the collaborative effort of all these people backing each other up, and seeing what happens when you do a strength in numbers type of performance. And around that time, there's a venue called DC9, and it's just the number 9. It's all one word, DC9. It's on 9th Street in DC, right off of U and 9th, about 2 or 3 blocks from the famous 930 Club, which is a world famous music venue here in DC. And I had pitched to this guy named Steve Lambert, who books that venue, the idea of doing a collective show, and my idea was just going to be the 9 songwriter series, or the 9 at DC9. And from seeing Hotel Cafe tour and seeing 10 out of 10, my idea was, we're going to do a show specific to this venue, using their title and the name, 9 artists at DC9. Each of us are going to draw a small portion of the crowd so that collectively we can pack the room and get into better venues collectively than we could ever on our own. And then throughout the night, we'd each play 3 songs, but we would, actually at the time it was 4 songs. I shortened the show a little bit a couple years later to make it smoother. But there was a couple problems, like I said, one of which is it's hard to play a venue on your own. It's hard to be and you're a drummer, so you probably play with lots of people who, like when they play, a headlining set at a venue, it's all 100% their responsibility to pack that venue, to sell those tickets.
Right.
And that's tough. It's tough if you're not a marquee name, if you're not a national headliner with radio play and marketing. So, it would take making it a lot easier when, each artist now has to draw 15 people, so that collectively, with 9 people on the bill, that's 135 people total. And if we're playing to a room that's 100 capacity, then that means we've sold out the room. If we're playing to a room that's, 200 capacity, that means the room is a really well populated room. And oftentimes, Roberto, the 9 shows over the years, as we've done them, have been some of the biggest shows that a lot of the artists that participate in them have ever done. A lot of the artists truthfully do the 9 sometimes when they're just getting started, before they're really getting a grasp and getting an audience and stuff. The 9 is a great opportunity for them to do some collaborative stuff, to get in front of a bigger crowd. We just did a show that sold out last week at a venue down the street from where I am right now, called Hill Country Barbecue, which is a Texas barbecue place on the first floor, and downstairs it's a 200 capacity venue standing, but seated it's half of that. Seated it's like 125, and we sold it out. And for about 3 or 4 of the artists, that was the biggest show they'd ever done, which is great. I mean, it's really awesome to see how happy these artists are to be like, oh my God, I'm playing to a sold out crowd of people. They're all seated. They're all here to hear me. Because, as an artist sometimes that's just getting started and you're playing like in a bar, oftentimes you're playing in a bar and there's like a TV and it's just over your head behind you.
Yes.
And people are kind of looking at you, but they're not. You can't necessarily tell if they're staring at you or the TV. And then like halfway through your song about your ex-girlfriend, they start just like clapping and like, this immense applause. And you're like, wow, this is weird. I've never had applause during this part of the song before. And then you realize that had nothing to do with you. It's because someone scored a touchdown,
Yeah.
So it's really great to get people out of those situations and into places where, people really care. Especially in DC, where it's not necessarily a music town. You go to Austin, you lived in Texas, you go to Austin and people are a little bit more willing to go out and listen to things that they don't know. Mm-hmm. But if you're in a city where it's, politics and nonprofit, and NGOs and, it's a little bit more, you have to provide a little bit more of a reason for people to attend. Or, a math equation. Like I always, I don't know if you ever saw that movie Moneyball with Brad Pitt, where that story was kind of about how I think it was the Oakland A's, right? When they basically created kind of like a math equation around baseball versus just what they traditionally had always done, where it was just like, we're going to get the biggest and strongest players, and that'll just mean that we're the best, right? Well, it didn't. And so they kind of did it more on a statistics basis, and then which didn't necessarily look like it was the strongest players. But statistically it was great. Well, for me, it's like, if everybody just draws a small amount of people, it's mathematically almost impossible for us to not pack the room, because it's so minimal. But it's been really great. That show started as a little side project at DC9, and now it's been in many venues around the East Coast. We've done it in the West Coast several times. It's got a residency in New Orleans. I've got people that produce this show for me in other cities, similar to the way that people produce So Far shows and the Moth storytelling shows, which are international organizations. My 2.0 of the 9 is to have it go to more and more cities, and as well as there actually be a 9 tour of 9 static artists. I think that would be really cool, especially if it can be some slightly bigger artists where we can get them in some really quality venues. And of course, now we've just had our 6th annual holiday show at the Kennedy Center, which we've done now, obviously, for the last 6 years, which has been great. Very cool.
And for those who have the gears in their head turning, has it turned out for the artists as it's gone along that you guys can actually end up being or having done a decent paying gig, and I assume it's worth. I mean, it probably means more than just that, but yeah, does it end up paying the artist pretty well as well?
So the way that the 9 works is that each artist gets 1/10 of the money made at the end of the night. Mm-hmm. So truly, Roberto, unless we're drawing 1,000 people, no one is ever going to honestly get rich off of the 9. And you probably think about this too, although I'm not sure. Have you ever been part of a band, Roberto, that was like a 8-piece, a 10-piece band? I always look at those bands as a person who is a full-time musician. I always look at those bands. I'm like, oh my God, how does any one of those bands make money? There's so many people in the band. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I have, but as a part-time musician, and I was actually surprised at how much they did make. And the irony of it was, the founder really wasn't interested in making money. He'd based, this was a percussion ensemble of all things too, but he had based it out of a church. So he was really interested in giving money to the church, which we still did. But the band finally said, well, we kind of want to get paid, and got paid pretty well. But I've worked with, one other one comes to mind, just on kind of interim basis. And I'm always just taken aback by the complexity of the whole thing, because I honestly like playing in 3 pieces because it just, there's so much room to try and do things. But yeah, it's a lot different.
With the 9, like I said, everyone gets 1/10 of the money. So to give you an example, and to make it very transparent, we played at Hill Country Barbecue. We had 116 people, which sold out. It was a sold out seated show. And of course, I think I told you that that's a 200-person room, but seated, for the people who may not know, and I imagine most of them are, seated makes the room smaller. Mm-hmm. If it's of course. So, after like a venue split, if it's, I don't know, 70-30 or whatever it might be, whatever that amount of money is, we split 10 ways. And so that night, every artist made $130. And when it's like a Thursday night, not necessarily weekend, and you're playing 3 songs and you're sometimes fairly new and you just want, to be able to play in front of a lot of people and be building your name, building your brand, your getting people to know who you are, that's worth it to a lot of those people.
Sure. Yeah, totally.
And it's worth it to me too. I mean, I don't suggest anyone, plays 9 shows for their full-time job, but it's been a great way for me and my friends to get in front of a lot of people. And it's also been kind of like a masterclass in performing, because for a lot of people, Roberto, a lot of artists are not necessarily virtuoso musicians where they can like jam with people. A lot of times they know how to play their instrument well enough to convey their really good song.
Right.
But outside of that, they're not necessarily the kind of person that would quote unquote jam with someone. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I'm not shocked to hear this. I hadn't really given it a lot of thought. I feel like I've played honestly with like one, like real songwriter. Other situations have just been bands, like rock bands or dance bands. But this guy was a well-versed musician. But I don't know if I think I'd heard him or seen video of him playing with another band. So he was a good guitar player. So yeah, he probably could. But when I reflect on all the people I've talked to on the show, I don't know. It doesn't surprise me though to hear that.
I would venture to say there's probably a lot of singer-songwriters you talk to on the show that couldn't play with other people, because that and maybe not even would want to play with other people.
In some cases that's true.
So the 9 is heavily based around the collaborative side of it. So when I'm booking the 9, I'm finding people that are okay with collaborating with other people, because it's I have to tell them don't. The other thing too is like we don't really rehearse. Like we get there 2 hours before the show starts to work out songs,
have your shit together when you get there.
Yeah, but like for a lot of people, they're like, oh my God, you mean not only do I have to collaborate, but we have to make it up essentially on the spot? And yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And so like I was saying, like this has kind of turned into almost like a master class of how to sit in with people with little to zero rehearsal and make something good. I always tell people it does not have to be perfect. And in fact, screwing up in front of the crowd is totally okay, as long as you make it okay for the crowd to be entertained that way. If you screw up and try to pretend like that screw up didn't happen, then that's going to be weird. But if you're just having fun and you're having a good time, the crowd's going to have a great time. And that's why the 9 is done so well. I mean, that's like I said, that's why the Kennedy Center has us back, every year to do our annual holiday show. And why, we're going to play at the City Winery this Friday, and it's a 150 capacity room, and we'll probably sell it out.
I love that. And so has the podcast and this songwriter series, have they, or has the podcast been able to help or be part of, kind of the marketing piece of it at all? And I ask because I'm thinking, again, I was wondering, gosh, should I be suggesting to musicians to think about doing a podcast as a way to kind of promote some of the stuff they're doing? But have you found it helpful? Or
I mean, I think that I think that this is what I was maybe meaning when I was talking about how the point of my podcast has kind of changed a little bit since starting to do it on my own, is that I think that the 9, the podcast, my band, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of those things are basically just different avenues for people to engage with not only the projects that I'm doing, but me in general. Yeah. So if you're listening to the podcast, you'll discover my band, you'll discover the 9, because I'll inevitably talk about it, or I'll get my website out. You'll go there and you'll be like, oh, what's this? What's the 9? If you're at a 9 show, again, the thing with the 9 is that 8 people on the 9 are bringing, because I perform with most of them, unless it's a city I'm not in. 8 people on the 9 are bringing their own following. like, I'm not a promoter of these shows. Like, the Nine is not bringing 150 people on its own. The whole point is that we're each bringing a crowd. So, there are 8 people's crowds worth of people that come and see me, just like there's 8 people's crowds of people that come and see one of the other people on the Nine.
Yeah, yeah.
And they'll see me and they'll be like, oh, he was really great. And they'll go to my website and they'll discover that I do a podcast too, And even so, and it even breaks down more than that. Like the podcast, for this will be the 5th year or the 6th year, I think, coming up in July, does an annual anniversary show at the 930 Club. It's always in the summer. This year it's July 27th, and it's not, I don't go on stage and talk. I am not delusional to the fact, Roberto, that people want to show up at a 1,000-person concert venue and hear me, talk like an ADD poster child. That I know that people do not want to do that. They do want to show up and hear some great music. And so I book usually my band and like 3 or 4 other really great local or regional bands. And we put on a big concert. But like I said, of the people that come that are fans of the other bands, they might discover me that way, or vice versa. They'll discover another band. So I think that all these mediums nowadays are just ways of furthermore establishing your overall brand. So to say, for you to suggest to other people to start a podcast, I definitely think it couldn't hurt. It couldn't hurt at all. It would only be beneficial. The only problem with the internet, social media, podcasts, all that stuff is that everyone can do one. There's no, if everyone can do one, the only thing that you can do to make you, to set yourself aside from everyone else is to provide something that's original, engaging, unique, or better. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. If you're doing one that's not engaging, you're just probably you're not going to be doing yourself any worse, but it's probably not going to be helping. You know what I mean?
Sure. And to market it well, of course. But what you've said makes total sense. It is, I think, if I were ever to make the suggestion, it would be for somebody who may have the inkling, if I can use that word, to do something like a podcast and tell them, it can be part of your community ecosystem. And I've actually have seen a couple that's been on the podcast in different interviews that they just recently started one, and they're super, super, dedicated to nurturing and building their community. And this was yet another thing to help them do that. So yeah, makes good sense. So taking a bit of a left turn, I was also curious about, your band, The Common Good, and your discography history that I could see this afternoon in the time that I was kind of looking at some of your work again. You have a part that looks like it precedes The Common Good. So you have this, looks like a solo thing you were doing, and now you have the band. And I was just curious to know, now that we've talked a little bit more, do you still kind of have 2 separate things, or was The Common Good just an evolution, and it's still kind of the same as it always was, but you had some reason to make it be more like this, like a band?
When I graduated from college in 2004, I started playing open mics, and I started meeting people that were becoming band members. I've had band members come and go, but since about 2005, I've played with 2 of the same guys in my band since 2005 or so, to 2006. Gene Finstead, who plays upright bass with me. When I was a kid, I used to listen to a lot of G-Love and the Special Sauce, and they have a upright bassist in their band, and I always thought that was super cool, and that is the exact reason why I have an upright bassist in my band. And then I also met a gentleman named Josh Himmelsbach, Josh Himmelsbach was in a band. I met Gene at a place called Solly's in DC, and I was there playing, I think, like some sort of showcase or something. And Gene was there. I remember vividly, he was there, and he was hanging out with the DC Roller Girls, like the roller derby team based in DC. like, you ever seen roller derby? Like, there's women that will, like, go around in a circle and kick the shit out of each other. It's amazing. And he was hanging out with those. I was like, holy cow, that's badass. This guy, like, is hanging out with DC roller girls. And I remember he came up to me and he was like, hey man, you were great. Like, if you ever need a bass player, I play bass. And very shortly thereafter, I think he played bass with me. At the time I had an upright bassist named Rick Netherton, he's essentially family at this point. Like, we are very good friends. I see him all the time, but he had a job. He was and not as available as I really needed for a person that was, essentially having two full-time jobs, an actual day job. And then, Roberto, I'd play a gig, get off work at 6:00, drive to Philly with the band, play in Philly. The gig would be over at 1:00, get home at 3:30 in the morning and be back at work the next day. And we'd do that, 15 times a month.
Yeah, it's tough.
Rick was have you ever seen, what's it called? It's on Showtime. It's the show about, not Drexel. What am I trying to say? It's the show about the guy who is the serial killer who works for the Miami Police Department.
Dexter.
Dexter. Yeah. So my buddy Rick he was a first responder for, Fairfax Police Department in Virginia. And he was the real life version of Dexter, short of being a serial killer. He had like a mobile crime lab. It was so cool. But, the problem is like somebody, no joke, if somebody got killed in the middle of our show, he would have to leave. And that was, that made gigging hard sometimes.
Yeah.
As you can tell, and, so I started playing with Gene, and, then I met this guy named Josh Himmelsbach, who is like the smartest guy I've ever known. He is a mathematics professor at Catholic University in DC. And it's always very smart to have a friend who is excellent at math. I don't know if you're good at math, Roberto. I know that you fold your socks a certain way, so I feel like you might be. But
you're making a lot of assumptions.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. But Josh and I met because he had a band called 10 Feet Tall, and they were, I don't really use Craigslist anymore, but there was a time when Craigslist was really, really booming for me.
Mm-hmm.
And finding apartments, finding band members, missed connections. I actually am the product of 2 missed connections, which is a whole other story. But, there was a band that was advertising looking for a lead singer. I was like replying back and forth with that band. I decided that no, I didn't really want to join someone else's band. I wanted to start my own, but I befriended that band in the process. And this guitarist from that band was this guy named Josh. And so Josh kind of started every once in a while sitting in with my band on guitar and then also on mandolin, which he was learning at the time. And then at some point it just kind of like, it's probably like dating. You probably remember back like even when you were dating, like you were dating someone until you realized that, oh, I have a girlfriend now. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And, with Josh, it was kind of the same way. Like he was just kind of sitting in with us. And I was like, oh no, he's actually a band member now at this point without us ever talking about it. And then to answer your question, because I've answered all of your questions the long, drawn-out way. I really apologize, Roberto.
I'm guessing it's your way, but it's okay.
Yeah. So for years, the band was just my name. Live, it was the Justin Trawick Group, but on record, on a recording, it was just Justin Trawick, just like Jason Mraz or Ben Harper or anybody. And then we were also, though, much more of a rock band. So, no, we still did a lot of Americana stuff, but there were drums, there was electric guitar, stuff like that. And in the last 4 or 5 years, Roberto, we've kind of morphed basically almost fully into the instrumentation of a string band. That is not to say that we are still not doing hip-hop songs and funk songs and stuff, but instrumentation-wise, the band has morphed into still upright bass, Josh now playing mandolin 99% of the time, as opposed to electric guitar, a fiddle player, and me, acoustic guitar. I also have a pedal steel player and And I do have a percussionist that's been somewhat with some of our bigger shows, or like when I'm going down south, because he lives in Richmond, which is about 2 hours south of DC. But when the band kind of started morphing into fully a string band, I really wanted to give it more of like a unique name that wasn't just my name. Because I think it's, it was important to separate the two things that I had once done and am doing now. As well as I also think in the grand scheme of marketing, band names I think are kind of a bit more cooler, truthfully, I think, than just someone's solo name. Also, it's easy to now explain without explaining it all when I'm playing by myself versus when I'm playing with the band. If it just says Justin Trawick, I'm not playing with the band. If it says Justin Trawick in the Common Good, I am. Previously before, like there wasn't as much of a understanding. So, it's like I said, when I started this, I didn't have some sort of famous uncle who was a producer and taught me how to do everything right the first time. This has been like a 12-year learning experience. I feel like I still do things wrong every day, all the time, even yesterday. I mean, I had a whole thing that I did wrong yesterday, but for the most part, I think I'm figuring it out.
And what was that happened yesterday that was so wrong?
Yesterday, I basically almost got banned, not banned, but, well, kind of banned. So I do a lot of projects, as we've talked about, and I also book 4 different bars in DC. So to my own detriment, Roberto, I have, to some degree, if I don't organize myself well, I have found myself easily able to be spread too thin, which oftentimes, as a good example, causes me to be constantly behind on things like answering emails. I am feeling like I'm perpetually in apology mode when it comes to emailing people. I'm like, hey, I'm sorry, it's been a week or a couple days or a month since I emailed you. And I had to dig myself out of a hole yesterday with this very good venue in San Francisco that I'm currently talking back and forth with about having a show, having the 9 in there.
May I ask which one? Are you at liberty to say what venue that is?
I mean, it's a small venue, but it's very known. It's a venue called Hotel Utah.
Yeah, I love that place. That's what I was hoping you were going to say. I don't know why, but I was like, that's got to be Hotel Utah.
Yeah, and there's a gentleman, his name is Keith, and he's a very nice guy. We've never met in person, but we've emailed over the years. And I thoroughly pissed him off for good reason, because he emailed me 2 different times, and 2 different times I emailed him a month back later, which for no good reason, other than the fact that I completely got caught up with other things, got caught up with running a band. I always feel like, and I think that this is everyone's hope as a musician. I need a manager. You hear people start all the time, like right when they start playing music, I need a manager. Well, truthfully, you don't need a manager. You only usually need a manager when the work is there, when there's too much work to be done and someone else literally needs to manage it. You know what I mean? And to some sort of degree, I probably actually am at that point now, but I'm still managing myself. And I do a lot of it fine and a lot of it well. When we're done with this fall, I'm going to a private gig that's going to pay my rent, and we do a lot of these things, and I'm constantly, on email or phone booking these things. But for everything that I'm emailing, every person I'm emailing with, I'm constantly missing one.
Yep.
Or not getting back to them fast enough.
Have you heard?
And I had to.
I'm sorry to interrupt before, because I'll forget. But have you heard of a service called Fancy Hands by chance?
No, I haven't. But I also have to say it again because I didn't understand you.
It's fancyhands.com. So
Fancy Hands?
Yeah, it's a site for it's kind of an outsourcing site, but it's for microtasks. And I was like, oh, that would have been a perfect microtask or an example of one. Maybe a subset of your emails, like make sure these people get responded to. And so anyway, it as opposed to like an Upwork or something like that, where you're hiring somebody for a kind of a more significant gig, be it long term or short term. This is more for like, again, micro tasks, small things that you need done right now and all kinds of stuff. But anyway, I was just curious if you're maybe at an in-between point too, where this, could help you out with some of the stuff you're doing. But anyway, continue.
No, I mean, that sounds awesome. That sounds like something I would definitely be into. I mean, Roberto, it's like I said, I had to kind of apologize to this guy, because he doesn't know me. I mean, other than our email communication, he doesn't know who I am. So he hasn't. I told him, like, everything you're telling me is true. You have no reason to believe that I'm not a flake. I know that I'm not, but I also know that I've spread myself too thin, and oftentimes my biggest downfall is the timely communication with people. Not because I don't care, but because I am catching up. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And what happened?
So what?
So what happened in the end?
So he's actually currently he's giving me a chance. Currently, nice. He's like, all right, no problem. So he's like, don't prove me wrong, and here's a date to hold, and present me with the lineup, and we'll confirm it. So I think that was a very nice, very human thing for him to do, and I was even telling my girlfriend yesterday, before he emailed me back, because I was assuming that he was just not going to email me back. I'm being very truthful with you, by the way. This is not something I am necessarily proud of, but I do think that it's probably something that people can identify with. This kind of stuff happens to people all the time, where they kind of learn something the hard way.
Oh yeah, and that was very human. I was going to say what you did, and just being very candid with him, and apologetic and all that. So good for you that it's working out. And did you say it's for the 9 songwriter series that you got? You actually
yeah,
that's nice. That's very nice. I got to know the date now. When is it?
So we're working on potentially either April the 10th or April the 17th. We've got 2 dates on hold. And I'm going to reach out to the musicians that I know in San Francisco and surrounding areas, and come up with the best date based on the most availability.
Cool. I think that's great. I cut you off again, but I had to ask you that. Did you finish your? I think I cut you off. Did you finish your string of thought there? On
I have no idea. My entire life is just a series of thoughts, so it's not. Don't worry about it.
Well, I was going to say, before we hit the perpetual record button, you were commenting about me coming across as so organized, and then here as we're talking, you're. I forget exactly what you said, but you were implying that, you can be somewhat of a mess sometimes or unorganized. But when I look at what you're doing, and the idea that you were doing all this by yourself, you really got it going on. You are, you appear to be doing quite well on social. You've had a lot of projects. You run the songwriter series, the podcast, and maybe you're getting a lot of help. You did say that you're really good at finding team members and delegate, sort of working out, being with people who bring their own strengths to it and are willing to contribute. It sounds like, and you enjoy and are good at, perceive yourself as good at delegating, which I think is awesome, and something I've always just being a sort of lifelong gigging musician, I've always advocated is why not work with other musicians that can contribute to some of those things that you have got to do to get yourself out there. But I think you're doing it sure looks like you're doing a great job.
I appreciate it. To bring up Eli Lev again, because you interviewed him for a past podcast. He and I actually had a business meeting, like a coffee meeting, like 2 or 3 weeks ago, where I kind of told him, a little bit about, and we had a meeting because he already kind of knew this, because he knows me well enough. And we don't know each other very well. We've only known each other for like the last year, but he could kind of tell through me that I've got good ideas, but the implementation of a lot of these things on my own is kind of the hard part for me. And we had a meeting because he was interested in helping, helping organize some of the Nine shows like out of town, helping find people who could be like producers in other cities, helping, for example, finding sponsorship. Like, I don't know, just as an example, like Acoustic Guitar Magazine or something like that, maybe being a sponsor or like a local radio station or something. The nice thing about the Nine specifically, among the other things that I do, is the Nine is very much a community event. The Nine is like, there's a lot of people that is a part of it. It feels very family oriented. And so I think of all the projects that I do, I think the Nine actually has the ability, more so than anything else, to get sponsorship, to get, advertisers, to get grants, anything like that, of which is all like a great idea, but like, man, it's all kinds of more work. And so what better way to, what better way to do that than to find someone who knows how to? And Eli has actually done a lot of the stuff before. So that's one of the things that we were talking about, was him helping with stuff like that, which goes back to you talking about delegating and finding people to be part of the team. I don't mind splitting up, I don't mind splitting up the money that something makes to include someone else in on something that can make something better, as long as it's getting better. And I think that bringing people into one of my essentially babies in projects to make something better and bigger would be the right move.
Yeah, that's cool. And Eli seems like another guy that really has his act together, so to speak. And he certainly, I could see he's a nice guy, and he seems like he'd be really enjoyable to work with. I want to be respectful of your time, but I did have one more question. I know you have a gig tonight, too.
I'm having a great time, Roberto.
Thanks.
I'm really glad that we got to talk today.
Yeah, thank you. Me too. For people who are curious, myself included, when in this particular type of event and what your event has become, you mentioned the community feel aspect of it, which I presume has some appeal. And there's probably also other appeal for the event because of the way it is presented and what it actually is, and now its history and your reputation, I'm sure, contributing to that. Are there things, I assume yes, and if so, what are they? But are there things beyond that sponsors, like the company that you threw out as an example, the kind of things that they look for when you approach them to sponsor, or if you're looking for a grant, specific things that other artists or musicians would want to know that they need to consider when they ask for sponsors for something like this?
Truthfully, Roberto, I have no idea. I've never gotten sponsorship or grant money for something like this. I have had people, I have and still do have advertisers for the Circus Life. But that, I think, is a different angle. That's more of like an advertising thing. Mm-hmm. Although I still think it would be advertising based for the Nine, but I think with like the Nine, the selling point is a couple different things, and the value added for like a sponsor to me would largely be due to the fact that our shows are well attended.
Right. So
they would be all winners in regards to being in front of a lot of eyeballs for the sponsorship of whoever that sponsor was. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. In regards to both sponsorship and grants, the Nine is not a singular band. It's not my band and I'm just trying to get my band more money.
Right.
That's not very newsworthy. That's, to me, the Nine, because it's incorporating so many different people from the community, people who have all kinds of different stories. We're all coming together because music oftentimes, Roberto, is kind of like every man for himself. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Or at least it feels that way sometimes. Sure. So yeah. The Nine being much more inclusive, much more collaborative, people from all different walks of life, different musical worlds. The fact that we're combining our draw capability, and the fact that it's local to whatever city we do it in. If we do it in New York, it's usually all New Yorkers. If we do it in Philly, it's all Philly people. Same thing in San Francisco. So I think that there's a lot of potential for interest in financial help due to the fact that there's a story behind it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Everything is about everything is about everything that we know of. We know about it because it was newsworthy for some reason. You know, all the best stories are good stories because they're meaningful in some way. And I think that the 9 has the ability of being that way. You know, I mean, it's hard to take my word for it because I'm the guy that runs it, but I would imagine that if you got in touch with Louisa Hall, for example, who is a local singer-songwriter in DC, she's got a lot of great videos on YouTube. You should check her out. You should probably talk to her too. I would, you know, in the same way that Eli suggested me, I would suggest that you talk to Louisa Hall. And I would suggest you ask her about the 9, and because I think that she probably would give you a very good assessment as to how she feels about it. I would venture to say she would probably talk about how it's really helped her stage presence, her on-stage persona, her songwriting, and the collaborative, you know, being able to make up music on the spot, and, you know, build a following in DC.
That's very cool. I appreciate the recommendation. So, to kind of wrap up on that question, does this mean that I may have misunderstood, but are you kind of going into a new chapter with the 9 where you're going to start seeking out sponsors where you have not in the past, or did you mean to say that actually that's sort of fallen in the lap of some of my co-conspirators?
Yeah, I mean, I had brought that up. I had brought up sponsorship and like grants kind of thing a few minutes ago when I was saying how Eli and I had a meeting.
Got it.
And so that was kind of like 2.0
okay.
of the 9 would be kind of like, you know, because I said earlier, for example, like the way that the show currently works is everyone gets 1/10 of the money made at the end of the night. And I also made a joke about how no one's getting rich during the 9. But how cool would it be, Roberto, if we were able to get some sort of like grant or sponsorship where, in addition to everyone getting 1/10 of the night, I was also able to pay everyone out a couple $100 more, you know, as an example, or even $50 more, which is from some sponsorship money to make it more worth their time, to make it more worth, like, you know, treating an artist well, because, you know, all artists, whether you're full-time or not, usually in some degree are struggling, whether it's financially or just like emotionally. It is a hard business. I mean, it's a hard world. You're trying to sell yourself, and you have to be really, really open to, you have to be really open to failure. And I don't mean failure in a massive failure, but like to people saying no, to people. You have to be open to Keith from Hotel Utah emailing you very nicely and saying he thinks that you should probably look elsewhere for a different venue. And I read that email sitting in my car in front of the Harris Teeter, which is a grocery store on the East Coast. And I was just in my running car, just going, man, I'm 37 years old. I've made, you know, I just sold out 2 shows. I just sold out 2 shows last week, and I was feeling on top of the world. And now this person, and I'm not saying that he said anything wrong. He said very much the right thing, but he very much brought me back down to reality. You know what I mean? And
and it brings me to a point of thought I had as you were saying, you know, you have to be introspective or you know, be honest with yourself. And you really got to be humble. I was going to say, you know, I'm just a drummer, and I don't mean to downplay drummers, because honestly, I think 2 things will mess up a band: a bad singer and a bad drummer, quicker than anything. But you know, the weight that a songwriter has, or someone in your position who's putting this who's been running this songwriter series, it's a lot of weight. And you know, myself, I just as a drummer, I still make mistakes in situations like, you know, not too unlike what you were describing with your guy at Hotel Utah. and then and then the voices in your head, all that kind of self-doubt stuff. So yeah, you're right. Today I was composing an email to go out to my list to say, hey, my mentors have been telling me for months I need to start coaching other musicians. And I asked one of them recently, how do you propose I get started? And he wisely suggested I take on three musicians pro bono to get, social proof, street cred, testimonials, and just get a little experience at it, right? And so I'm writing this going, I know that, being a musician can be challenging, and I've faced all those challenges, probably the same ones that you have, and dealt with them. But one of the ones that didn't occur to me while I was writing that email, but I have talked about, or I've had the pleasure of talking about with other artists, are the emotional aspects of it. Even though I know that a lot of the challenges that we create are emotionally based, but there's a lot of heavy stuff, though, for some people that I've been fortunate enough not to experience, but there's a lot of heavy emotional stuff that can creep into one's life, maybe having nothing to do with their music. And so, yeah, I just wanted to mention that. I don't know why I felt important, but yeah, thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah, totally. I really appreciate you doing what you're doing in terms of your podcast and offering this platform, for musicians to talk about what they're doing on a more narrow business kind of scale. Because I think a lot of times people listen to music and listen to artists and have no idea what they're going through on the back end to get where they are. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, it's pretty. It's funny, not haha funny, but I understand. Not everyone mentions it, but every once in a while somebody mentions some of these things that we just don't think about, whether we're music fans or maybe even, a lifelong gigging musician, drummer or whatever, but some of the things that sort of fall in the category of, self-talk and self-doubt and stuff. And inevitably, like you, for example, will get an email from me later with some follow-up questions that might include, how do you deal with that kind of stuff? But inevitably I get these wonderful responses to that kind of thing, which is just a case in point. We all go through it, and I think it's something that I hope it's great for other musicians to hear or read about. In the case of that particular question, to read about on the blog, but certainly I hope it's good for them to hear about. Like your humbleness here, talking about the hotel Utah thing, and I've certainly been involved in similar types of things myself. And anyway, hope it's helpful. But it's all my pleasure too. I think you probably know from doing a little podcasting yourself how fun it can be to talk to and learn from people like yourself.
Totally, man. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, totally.
Well, listen, I want to thank you for your time with me today, and tell you that I think I'm probably going to hit you up for this again sometime. There's a lot of different things that we can explore, and you are a lot of fun to talk to. And boy, it was fun learning about the 9 series. I knew so little about it. It was really fun to learn about it. I think it's super cool. I hope that I find out about others that do similar things, or that you were perhaps an inspiration for others to consider doing something like that. Because what a wonderful way to get other artists some exposure and give them, as you said, that kind of masterclass experience that it's becoming. Yeah.
Roberto, I think we need to do one in Panama. I think that all of our discussion is leading us to the natural conclusion that we need to take this international and in Panama. Okay?
That sounds good to me. I'll work on my in-person interviewing tech. I did one recently for a different podcast, and I was like, oh, yeah, I definitely need to upgrade the gear for that. I'm so used to doing this, but you got it, man. I'm open to it. We'll have to talk more about that.
All right. Cool, man. Well, and thank you very much for having me. I look forward to doing something with you again.
Absolutely. The pleasure was all mine.
And I feel my mind is failing, and I think my skin is growing thin. And I wonder if I'll remember all those places I've been. And I ain't walked tall in ages, and my back just don't bend that way. And my hair was once receding, now it's all gone away. And I was born in Oklahoma, on a farm outside of town. And I spent my days out wandering in the fields behind our house. And I wondered what was out there beyond the fences of our home. And I left town for the army when I turned 18 years old. And I remember what it felt like as I raced onto the shore. The cool breeze and the salt air, June 6th, 1944. And I watched my friends get mowed down by the Mausers on the hill. And I don't know how I made it, but I thank God that I did. And I found myself near D.C. when the war was finally done. And I got myself a family, a wife and 3 young little ones. And I ran for public office, becoming mayor of my town. And my parents stood right by me, and my wife said she was proud. We lived through the Truman Doctrine as Jackie took the field, and the Rosenbergs were sentenced, and segregation was repealed. And roses sat in silence, and Elvis sang a song, and the Cuban Missile Crisis marked the final days of John. And the Beatles crossed the ocean, and Dr. King was shot and killed. And Nixon left his office, oh, as the radio star was killed. And the Challenger exploded, and Oklahoma cried. And 13 people died by 2 troubled kids in Columbine. New York City's finest and bravest of them all climbed the city's towers minutes before they'd fall. And I remember what it felt like as my family stood and stared, because my son was of the bravest with those heroes climbing stairs. So I feel my mind is failing, I think my skin is growing thin, and I wonder if I'll remember all those places I've been.
Hey, thanks for listening. Question for you. Are you struggling to move your music journey forward? I can help, if not personally, then by referring you to the next best available resources. Schedule a free 15-minute call with me to find out if I can indeed help you. It's easy. Just visit unstarvingmusician.com/coaching to schedule your call today. Look for links to just about everything covered in this episode in the show notes at unstarvingmusician.com/podcast. This episode was powered by the Unstarving Musician's Guide to Getting Paid Gigs, How to Get Booked and Paid What You're Worth Over and Over Again. It's available on paperback, Kindle, and ebooks just about everywhere you can find them. It's also available as a standalone podcast called the Unstarving Musician's Guide podcast. You can learn more about the book and companion podcast at unstarvingmusician.com/book. I'd love it if you picked up a copy and would love it even more if you left a review. With much gratitude, peace, love, and more cowbell.